This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 6th of September 2025. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the week's news and culture with the Russian analyst and author Charles Hecker. Then, the head of literature and spoken word at the Southbank Centre, Ted Hodgkinson, joins us in the studio to discuss the London Literature Festival. So that's what's coming up here on Monocle on Saturday. First, though, here's the news. The United States is not talking about regime change in Venezuela, President Donald Trump said on Friday, as the US ordered an additional 10 stealth fighter jets to a military build-up in the Caribbean. We're not talking about that, but we are talking about the fact that you had an election, which was a very strange election, to put it mildly, Trump said, referring to the contested 2024 poll. The Venezuelan government says President Nicolas Maduro won. Hundreds of workers at a Hyundai car battery facility under construction in Georgia were detained in a raid by US authorities, stopping work on a plant that's one of the Korean automaker's major investments in the US. About 475 workers, mostly South Korean nationals, were arrested. Washington and Seoul have been at odds over the details of a trade deal. At a summit last month, South Korea pledged $150 billion in US investments, including $26 billion from Hyundai. A surfer attacked by a large shark at a Sydney beach has died of his injuries, police said today, the first such incident in more than 3.5 years, prompting the closure of several beaches. The victim, yet to be identified, was attacked about 100 metres from shore while surfing with friends just after 10 a.m. at Long Reef Beach in the north of the capital of the Australian state of New South Wales. And a lone red rose tied to the barrier outside the offices of Giorgio Armani in Milan's fashion district marked a quiet and poignant tribute to the legendary Italian designer on Friday, as the city mourned his death at the age of 91. The king of Italian fashion died on Thursday, half a century after he founded his namesake company, which has since grown into a luxury goods conglomerate spanning haute couture to perfume, makeup and even furniture. There'll be a private funeral on Monday afternoon. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. I'm Georgina Godwin, and in the studio with me is the Russia analyst and author Charles Hecker. Charles, earlier I said you were a Russian analyst. You're not actually Russian.
Try as I might, I'm still sort of tied to my American roots.
But all things Russia obsess you, I know this. And in fact, you read a Russian play last night.
That's right. So I went to see The Seagull, staged here at the Marylebone Theatre in London, directed by Russian director Malochnikov. Now his first name has completely gone out of my head. And this was essentially a play about putting on a play, very loosely bound, tied to Anton Chekhov's The Seagull, one of his most famous works of art. And it was a fascinating play. And what they do at the very beginning of the play is they tell the audience assembled in the auditorium that we are in Moscow. And frankly, given the number of expats in the audience, it genuinely felt like an evening at the theater in Moscow, which made it all the more exhilarating for it.
What fun. Do you think that Chekhov would recognize modern-day Russia?
Yes and no. I think that playwrights who wrote about periods of instability and transition in Russia, including novelists who wrote about similar periods, would recognize some of it. I don't think they would recognize quite the level of militarization or some of the trauma associated with it. But some of Russia's best literature and some of Russia's best stagecraft has come from writers who captured For example, the tension between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers in the 1800s. And this was a group of people who thought that Russia's future lied with Europe versus a group of people who thought that Russia's future was entirely of its own and Slavic in nature. And that begat a whole series of novels and stage productions that examine sort of the nature of the Russian soul. And that sort of examination has always produced fantastic art.
Well, there's a piece in the Moscow Times today, and this is about Putin, who the model of Putin himself is not unknown to Russian history. But he's made his declaration that peacekeepers are legitimate military targets. He's basically saying if there are foreign forces in Ukraine, he is going to attack them.
That's right. And he's done this by stating two separate things, actually. He said, first of all, if anybody is considering putting foreign forces on Ukrainian soil during a period of military hostility, that they will be legitimate targets. But then beyond that, he's even said that after a ceasefire or peace agreement, if there are foreign troops on the soil of Ukraine, that they would be, first of all, unnecessary, and secondly, also legitimate military targets. And what this comes in response to is efforts by a group of, so far, I think, 26 different countries known as the Coalition of the Willing, who are prepared, although we don't know yet in what number and in what composition, but a group of countries that are prepared to put boots on the ground in Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire. The strange thing here is that, particularly coming from the United States and the White House, everyone seems to be seeking Putin's permission to do this. And of course, he is not granting that permission. But the whole point of peacekeepers is that you put them there no matter what your opponent thinks. And they're there to stabilize a situation on the ground.
And the question, of course, is what is then a legitimate military target? And this is something we're seeing playing out in Venezuela, as we heard in our headlines. So the US is reportedly striking drug cartels, but Trump himself, as we heard, is saying that this is also about dodgy elections. It seems that there is an unnecessary amount of force deployed around there. F-35 warplanes have just been deployed. And of course, the initial fight took out 11 suspected cartel members. They weren't by any means definitely. Is that a death sentence just to be suspected?
Well, that's right. Apparently, in this particular incident, when the Trump administration dropped a bomb on a boat in international waters in the Southern Caribbean, killing all 11 people on board, President Trump was offered the option of arresting these individuals and seizing their cargo or killing them. And he dropped a bomb on them. And, he and Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary, although I suppose we now have to call him Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, said that this was a deliberate move to sort of, encourager les autres. And it's an escalation in existing tensions between Trump and Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. And it is culminating so far. I mean, this is a story that we have to watch and keep very much on top of and ahead of, because not only is he scrambling aircraft to Puerto Rico within striking distance of Venezuela, but there's been a phenomenal naval buildup just outside of Venezuelan waters. And I think the important thing to pay attention to here is an evolution in the way the United States and the Trump administration is using the expression national emergency or national security threat. The president has used those phrases and that language to justify everything from raids by immigration control, as mentioned at the very top of the program, and also, frankly, his tariffs are based on an 1800s law on national security and emergency threats. And this is an escalation in the type of the rationale that the president is using now for military activity. And so you start with a strike on a boat in the Southern Caribbean. Suddenly you've got naval warships and F-35s in Puerto Rico. And fairly thin ground for declaring national emergencies. So
you saw Trump's face light up when Volodymyr Zelensky told him that they couldn't have an election in Ukraine because you can't. When there's a war on, there's no election. And you could see the cogs turning. Is this the way we're going?
Well, President Trump is now exercising quite a lot of rhetoric around the upcoming midterm elections and then, of course, the 2028 presidential elections. First of all, President Putin told President Trump that the reason why he lost in 2020 was because of mail-in ballots. So the president the next day after meeting President Putin in Anchorage. President Trump the next day said he's canceling mail-in ballots. So there's attack number one on elections. And then there's sort of like, yes, elections during wartime. That's attack number two. And then there's the deployment of the National Guard to Washington, D.C., and the threat of the deployment of the National Guard to other cities like Chicago. And that is the sort of the militarization of the police and of army presence and military presence in American cities that look fairly close towards a sort of martial law situation that could also be used to postpone or suspend or annul elections.
Before we move on from Trump, I know both you and I are pretty obsessed with what's going on there, but just talk us through the change to the name, the Department of War.
That's right. So the Department of Defense, whose home is the Pentagon, the famous five-sided building in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., just over the road in Virginia, was previously known as the Department of War. But in a sort of demilitarization phase, sometime I think after after World War II, it was named the Department of Defense. President Trump doesn't really like the idea of being in a defensive posture. He likes an aggressive posture. And of course, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of War now going forward, has vowed to reestablish the culture of the warrior in the Pentagon and in the U.S. military. And so using the root of the word warrior in the naming of the department, I think fits quite nicely into this not quite defensive posture, but rather more aggressive and hostile posture of the U.S. military. And, Hegseth, who was sort of wearing his comedy socks as usual in the White House yesterday, was applauding this change and sort of building up his macho man image as the head of the Department of Things military.
Well, lots of change afoot here in Britain, of course, because there's been this big reshuffle. The Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, has gone. She was seen to have been broken the ministerial code. This was all to do with paying stamp duty taxes on a property. She's gone, and it's forced this big reshuffle. Yvette Cooper now is Foreign Secretary.
That's right. The British government looks very different this morning than it did just 24 hours ago. And of course, Prime Minister Keir Starmer was already in the midst of a reshuffle after his first and rather difficult year in office as Prime Minister. But the resignation of Angela Rayner, who was simultaneously Secretary for Housing, she was Deputy Head of the Labour Party, and she was Deputy Prime Minister. She has stepped back from all three of those positions and has returned to the back benches and forcing really a complete remake of the structure in and around number 10. So we now have, as you've mentioned, Yvette Cooper is the Foreign Secretary. Yvette Cooper actually is a long-standing government minister who has served before in an international brief. She served as a minister in Blair's cabinet. She worked in Treasury. She worked in pensions under the Gordon Brown prime ministership. She was shadow Home Secretary, and of course she was Home Secretary prior to her appointment as Foreign Secretary. She might be quite relieved, actually, to move from a domestic remit to a foreign portfolio, because she was, of course, put in charge of trying to reduce the number of people coming to the United Kingdom in boats across the English Channel. That hasn't been going very well for her. The world is a complicated place, but it might be easier to sit in the Foreign Office than it is to sit in the Home Office right now.
Well, David Lammy, of course, has gone from the Foreign Office to the Ministry of Justice. And there's big news on the justice front today because the AI startup Anthropic has agreed to pay $1.5 billion to settle book piracy lawsuits, which is fantastic news for authors.
That's right. For those of us who live in book world these days, this is a very big win, even though we have to say it was a settlement in court, but it was a $1.5 billion settlement entered into by Anthropic. And what Anthropic did was, without permission, it used books all over the world to train its large language model. And what this means is that when you enter a query into a chat GPT-like or Anthropic's model called Claude, as it's known, which is a big competitor to the slightly more popular and better known chat GPT. When you enter a query into a search engine like that, it responds to you as if you're in conversation, and it responds to you as if it is speaking natural language. The way it learns to speak that way, in inverted commas, is by reading essentially and hoovering up the language used in written text in millions and millions, in fact, billions of examples. Where Anthropic went a bit sideways was that some other generative engines like this have entered into agreements, for example, with the New York Times to use their material under copyright and to pay for the use of their text to train their large language models. Anthropic didn't do that, and now they're paying the price.
Well, somebody who really does know about this and works tirelessly to protect the rights of authors and writers and to promote their work is Ted Hodgkinson. So he's a fellow board member of English Pen, along with me, but he's also the head of literature and spoken word at the Southbank Centre. Ted, hi.
Lovely to be with you, Georgina.
It's really nice to have you in here. This is really great news for authors, isn't it?
It's undoubtedly great news and a really seismic shift, I think. And I think what it does is it really underscores how vital writers and wordsmiths are. You know, it's interesting that it's often been said that the sort of primary coding language at the moment is English language. And actually, there has been this kind of raiding of author IP and the extraordinary amount of work that's just been sort of pillaged. But actually, it's really reassuring that there has been this recognition with the caveats that you very deftly articulated. I think it can only be good news that the value of authors' work, the time, the dedication, the care with which they craft their sentences and their works is recognised and recompensed. Because, you know, there's huge money to be made in this, and that's because there's this extraordinary trove of art and information that we're all custodians of. And I think it's within the book world, of course, but it matters for everybody what happens with these companies and what happens with, as you say, it's going to become, it already is really, such an important interface in all of our lives. And I think for that to be recognised in this way suggests perhaps a bit of a sea change, hopefully.
Yeah. Now, Ted, you've got a really exciting event coming up. It's the London Literature Festival. It runs from the 21st of October to the 2nd of November. And it's at the Southbank Centre. And for our international listeners, I wondered if you could just start by perhaps telling us what the Southbank Centre is and what it might equate to in other countries.
Sure. So the Southbank Centre was born in 1951 in the wake of the Second World War in the Festival of Britain. It was this incredible endeavour of the Labour government at the time, the Attlee government, the same moment at the creation of the NHS, to bring the nation together. It was a phrase that it feels very much of the moment, but I still quite like, to be a tonic for the nation, to really sort of bring people together around arts and culture, to democratise the arts and culture, to make them more accessible to the many. 8 million people came through the turnstiles. It was this incredible site that was really full of life and every kind of, it was science, technology, the arts, a really wonderful space. There are really iconic buildings, the Royal Festival Hall, the Queen Elizabeth Hall, the Purcell Rooms, the Hayward Gallery, which came a bit later. We have an open foyer policy in 1983, which sounds very, perhaps, everyday, but actually the Southbank Centre was one of the first cultural institutions in the world to operate an open doors policy, and now you see it proliferating around the world. There isn't perhaps an exact correlation, but there are places like the Lincoln Centre, or if you go to Melbourne, perhaps, there's a fantastic art centre in Melbourne. There are some fantastic art centres around the world. I think it's fair to say a lot of them have drawn inspiration from the Southbank over the years. We're a space that tries to embody those founding principles. 50% of everything that we do on site is free. We really work hard to create unbeatable cultural experiences and to bring the broadest possible audience to our door. We're in the midst of an incredible multicultural city, but we also have very international audiences. One of the joys of being in the midst of London is when we program an event that speaks to a particular diaspora, we see an incredible upswell in that group coming into our spaces. You know, whether it's Angela Merkel coming to talk in the Royal Festival, or Chimamanda Adichie, you see these wonderful different communities within London coming into our spaces. And I think, yes, part of all of that as well is that we are a multi-arts centre, and London Literature Festival, as you mentioned, is a celebration of the written and spoken word, and very much embodies that breadth as well. Everything from really acclaimed international writers, prize-winning authors, Nobel Prize winners, and so on, to big personalities and cultural figures and icons from across our cultural life, to children's literature, events, fun events for families and young listeners, poetry and spoken word. We're the home to the National Poetry Library, which was created in 1953. T.S. Eliot opened it, and we have the largest collection of contemporary poetry anywhere in the world. It's free to access for anyone who wants to come in. It's a real haven.
I mean, it's just such an incredible service, isn't it? Tell us more then about this festival, the London Literature Festival, because I know that you've got a guest curator.
Yeah, so the London Literature Festival is running for 16 years, and it runs from the 21st of October to the 2nd of November. And as I mentioned, it's a really broad programme. One of the things we've been doing over the last few years, we've been working with an artist to guest curate a number of events in the festival. Last year we worked with the iconic and brilliant Getz, and this year we're working with Rebecca Lucy Taylor, also known as Self-Esteem. And I'm sure listeners will know, but Self-Esteem is an incredibly versatile, varied, unapologetic artist. She's incredible. One of the things that of course, I'm a big fan of hers, of course, I would say that up front. But I think one of the things we're always interested in with working with guest curators is perhaps an artist who's always pushing at the limits of what is expected of them. You know, she's a writer, she's an artist and a musician who creates these amazing anthemic, often very confessional songs. She brings in bits of diary, a sort of a sense of overhearing her inner monologue and her inner thoughts. She's very writerly in the way she constructs her songs. And if you go to her gigs, you'll see these amazing big all-caps statements behind her on the stage. So she's using language in ways that perhaps are surprising and I think very poetic at times. So yes, she's curated a number of events in the second weekend of the festival, including a conversation with Dolly Alderton about Rebecca's new book, A Complicated Woman, and also a night of spoken word and music, which promises to really go off. It's going to be fantastic.
You mentioned lots of big international names.
Yes, so I'm really, really pleased and excited that we've got a real array of international writers, some of my favourite authors out there in the world. So, for instance, Sayaka Murata, Japanese author of Convenience Store Woman, Bora Chung, brilliant Korean writer, Olga Ravn from a Danish writer who's also done various other projects with us at Southbank Centre, including an amazing immersive performance of her book, The Employees. Alexis Wright, Indigenous Australian writer, and Chris Kraus, a really brilliant countercultural kind of punk American writer. So a really broad range. And alongside them, we have some really brilliant homegrown writers, Zadie Smith, Claire Louise Bennett. And as you probably picked up, they all happen to be women, and it's just a great thing to see how many fantastic female writers are coming through and really leading the conversation about where the novel is going.
You've got three or four very well-known international women. Kamala Harris is coming.
Yes.
Reese Witherspoon.
Yes.
Malala Yousafzai. So, I mean, those are great. I mean, Reese, we know she runs her book club, but she's actually just produced a book with Harlan Coben.
She has. It's an interesting phenomenon that she's collaborated with Harlan Coben. We're really, really thrilled that she's part of the festival. As you say, she's been such an amazing champion for reading, and through her podcast, and really has sort of been an incredible galvanizing force in a way in our online lives about reading. And yes, she's collaborated with Harlan Coben. It's interesting. We had a pairing last year of Keanu Reeves and Chani Mayville, who collaborated around writing a novel as well. And it's interesting that it's a very different book and a very different collaboration this year. But we're really, really thrilled that to be welcoming Reese Witherspoon and Harlan to talk about that collaboration. Yes, we're really thrilled and excited to be hosting the UK exclusive event with Kamala Harris to talk about her book 107 Days, about the extraordinary events of the campaign that you were that was perhaps underlying some of the conversation you were having earlier. She's got an extraordinary story to tell, and it will be that rare opportunity to hear from her in her own words. I think that's one of the rare things about a space like the Royal Festival Hall, is that you can hear in human terms from people who've been real protagonists in our cultural life and have had a lot to do with all of the sort of convolutions and the pivotal moments of the last several years historically. Malala Yousafzai, incredible, iconic, courageous woman who has a book, a memoir that's reflecting on the last few years for her. We also have Nick Cave and Matt Smith talking about the new production of Bunny Monroe. So there's a real range of what we really want to do is demonstrate and reflect that literature is large, that storytelling is large, and that our cultural life is enriched by these storytellers, who some of whom are big figures from our cultural lives we'll all recognise, and some of whom are just at the forefront of really expanding and refreshing what fiction can do. I'm a really big believer in the space that fiction in particular can open up in our cultural lives for discussions and reflections around what it means to be a human in this very complicated and turbulent world.
Absolutely. Non-fiction too is of course important, and we've just seen the long list for the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction be released. So 12 writers on there. Now, Ted, I know that you have judged many prizes. You've judged the Orwell Prize for non-fiction, and alongside Robbie Millen, who is now the chair of the judges for this year's Baillie Gifford. I judged the Baillie Gifford myself a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. What is the process, do you think? Because this year's panel will have chosen an entirely different selection from last year's panel. Not just obviously because the books submitted are different, but I think you could put the same books in front of two different panels and get completely different results.
Yeah, absolutely. I did have the absolute pleasure of being on the panel, the Orwell Prize for Non-Fiction with Robbie a few years ago. And as you say, especially with readers as distinctive and expert as Robbie and yourself on these panels.
And Robbie is the literary editor for The Times and The Sunday Times.
Yes. Often panellists like Robbie will bring very distinctive sensibility to what they're reading. Is that the Orwell Prize is particular as well, because often we're reminded that we're reading under the kind of under the spectre of Orwell, in a sense, and that the values of his writing was something we were aiming for, in a sense. And the book we chose, Say Nothing, Patrick Radden Keith's Say Nothing, which is, I recommend to anyone, incredible novelistic account of the history of Northern Ireland, which was turned into an HBO series. I think what's interesting about judging non-fiction is that it's the range of subjects that a non-fiction prize can cover, and in this instance, we're the Baillie Gifford list ranging from, China's one-child policy to very personal memoirs of grief and suicide. It's an astonishing range. I think often it comes back again to storytelling, voice, how you're achieving, how each writer is setting out the terms of their project and how they're achieving or fulfilling that. You sort of, it's almost impossible for a panel to be fully expert in the full kind of panoply of things that are explored. But I think they're often coming at it in terms of how is this story being unfolded, and how is it, how is the author fulfilling the terms they're setting themselves?
It's a really great list. Very happy to see Frances Wilson on their list, to set Barbara Demick, lots of amazing writers here. Now, Charles, you're a non-fiction author. And so in terms of what Ted is saying is about how authors choose to lay it out, what's your take?
Well, so, there were a couple of different ways of structuring my first book. And, I guess the main driver is really chronology, because it's a contemporary history of Western business in Russia. And really one of the best ways of looking at that and establishing a narrative arc to a story is really just ordering it chronologically. The interesting thing about chronological order is that sometimes things just don't always fit very tidily into a sort of calendar format. And so you have these digressions that where in one case I sort of took about a century out of the calendar and went back in time into the Tsarist period. But what's the most fun, I think, and the thing that I look back most fondly in the experience of writing my first book, was the sense of agency that you have as an author, and that you sort of get to say that, look, I want this word to go there, and I want that word to go there, and I want this chapter to go here. And so, of course, until it hits the editor. But there's a great sort of creativity and freedom in actually structuring a nonfiction narrative, and I think that's what I enjoyed the most about writing the book.
Well, you'll know all about editing because, of course, you were in an editorial role at Granta magazine.
I was, yeah. It was a wonderful job. I worked in editorial with a fantastic team and have great reverence for the artistry that goes into writing, but also there was a sort of the commissioning process and that dialogue between author and editor is a very, very formative and vital thing, perhaps not that well understood. But yeah, I think it's, there's something conspiratorial about it, I think, at its best, that the editor is somehow the co-conspirator in the work, and that there's that they play an active role in encouraging and maybe, there's an amount of challenge there as well on a good day.
Well, Granta, of course, is absolutely held rightly in great respect for its printed product. And I want to talk a little bit about print because Vogue, it's all change at Vogue. Tell us the story.
That's right. Print is very, very much back in the news because there have been a spate of books recently written about some of the magazines that we will find sitting on our coffee tables in our homes. And then also, of course, this week, Anna Wintour took a half step back, you might say, from her role as editor of American Vogue and, of course, her role as the head of content at Condé Nast. And she appointed Chloe Malle as the editor of American Vogue. Chloe Malle was previously the head of Vogue.com website. She's also known as the daughter of Candice Bergen and the late director Louis Malle. Candice Bergen, interestingly, also played the editor of Vogue on Sex and the City, so that there is a bit of a through line here to the story. But one of the things that got Chloe Malle this job, which we're led to believe was highly contested, and I can imagine that was indeed the case, is that she said she might scale back the frequency of the monthly magazine in exchange for printing it on a better paper stock and encouraging readers and buyers and subscribers of the magazine to keep it. And to keep it at home as a reference point, as something to come back to, as something to hold on to. And I think we all have piles of magazines at home. I mean, whether it's The New Yorker or The Economist or Vogue or Monocle magazine, for example, the home in which, the house in which this broadcast is taking place. I've got piles of Monocle at home that I refer to periodically, especially when I travel. And I think that after Brexit, Monocle moved its publishing and printing to Germany and took out an improved paper stock that gives the magazine additional heft and makes it look even better on your coffee table.
Here is this month's issue, September issue, and it's beautiful. The story of Spain's mobility hero. It's got a little Rolsa shopping trolley on the cover. But the thing I like about it is just listen to the heft, the weight of that, isn't it? And the way it smells. Love the way it smells.
When you drop the magazine on your table, it lands with a reassuring thud.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Listen, we've got to end there, but Ted, just before we go, two things. One, I mentioned at the top that you are a fellow trustee of English Pen, and I think we should just reiterate to people that that's not just for writers. It's a writers' human rights group, but it's also for readers of books, but indeed readers of Monocle or anything else.
Absolutely. And actually, a lot of the international writers I mentioned earlier have been supported by English Pen's translation programme, and those books exist in English partly because of the work that English Pen does, the brilliant work that the Pen Translates programme does. It's an organisation that the lifeblood of it is reading, absolutely.
And now, the festival, just remind us of the details.
So London Literature Festival runs from the 21st of October to the 2nd of November. We have guest curation from Self-Esteem on the 1st of November. We have an incredible array of international writers running through the festival, from Sayaka Murata to Olga Ravin, and we also have some very well-known and very exciting figures from across popular culture, Kamala Harris to Malala.
Ted, thank you very much indeed. That's all for Monocle on Saturday. Thanks also to Charles Hecker, Ted Hodgkinson, as I said, and to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan. Mostly thanks to you for listening. Monocle on Saturday returns next weekend. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye.